Hi, my name is Ananish Chaudhuri. I'm a professor of experimental economics at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. I'm going to take a few minutes of your time to talk about my latest book, Nudged into Lockdown: Behavioral Economics, Uncertainty, and COVID-19, published by Edward Elgar. On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 an acute respiratory disease caused by the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 to be a pandemic. We all know what happened after that. The primary measure adopted to suppress, mitigate the disease took the form of extreme physical or social distancing, referred to as lockdowns. The widespread support for lockdowns was surprising, since this went against detailed pandemic guidelines developed by countries as well as WHO prior to this. It was also clear relatively early on that the collateral damage from the lockdowns exceeded any benefits by large magnitudes. Yet, these measures that imposed massive economic damage and unprecedented restrictions on our economic and social lives, as well as civil liberties, were readily accepted by the majority. Why were policymakers so eager to impose lockdowns, and why were ordinary citizens so willing to accept them? I provide an answer to these questions from the perspective of behavioral economics. I rely on extensive research in economics, psychology, neuroscience, and evolutionary theory to show how a range of cognitive biases played a role in the acceptance of restrictions around the world. Pandemics, such as COVID-19, generate uncertainty. Uncertainty is something humans are not comfortable with, since we crave certainty. Uncertainty leads to feelings of fear, stress, anxiety, a sense of having lost control over our own destiny. This in turn leads to a degree of irrationality, both in the public's perception of the problem as well as policy responses. For instance, there was inadequate recognition of the fact that stringent social distancing measures involved significant trade-offs between lives lost to COVID-19, what may be thought of as identified lives, and lives lost from other diseases as we diverted resources away from them towards COVID-19. Of course, there was also the losses associated with the loss in national output, bankrupt businesses, higher unemployment, not to mention the emotional trauma for everyone, including, say, for children denied the ability to go to school. This secondary loss of lives and livelihoods is often referred to as statistical lives. Things that happen in the background are diffuse in manner and are not generally picked up as easily or not blared on the front pages of our newspapers or on our television screens. For instance, in May 2020, the WHO declared that 80 million children around the world had missed routine vaccinations, resulting in a spike in diseases like diphtheria, measles, and polio. Reports of excess deaths, which means deaths above the historical average from various other causes, such as postponed surgeries, postponed detection of cancers, etc., were coming in steadily from other sources. Loss aversion played a major role. People were unwilling to accept some loss of lives in the present, even if it meant incurring much larger losses further down the road. As the cost of lockdowns mounted and the futility started to become apparent, the sunk cost fallacy kicked in. We had made such sacrifices to keep people safe. How can we give up now? The fact that the benefits of continuing down this road fell far short of the catastrophic damages being imposed on society just did not register. People often overweight small probabilities. They think that the probability of an event with low probability is actually much higher. The probability is much higher than it really is. This applied to COVID-19 vaccines. Yes, the rapid development of vaccines was a major scientific breakthrough, and we should celebrate that. But in general, people did not understand that it takes on average around a decade to develop a truly effective vaccine. It was therefore not surprising that the vaccines developed within the span of around 18 months proved ineffective against mutating strains of the virus. It was also going to be much more difficult than people thought to manufacture and distribute vaccines to around 7 billion people in the world. In fact, this feat has proved impossible till this point, resulting in numerous countries that have not managed to vaccinate even 10% of their population, while people in developed countries get multiple booster doses. A key assumption behind the lockdowns was that people cannot be trusted. They will not self-isolate even if sick. Yet, a voluminous body of research suggests this is incorrect. People are motivated by intrinsic motivations, and when asked to self-isolate or wear a mask, etc., they will readily do so, as long as you clearly explain the reasoning behind it. In fact, much of the action in preventing disease transmission came not from lockdowns, but from human reaction in adopting precautionary behavior. This suggests that coercive measures like vaccine mandates imposed by many countries around the world were unnecessary and caused tremendous economic and social damage. During the pandemic, a popular narrative took hold that liberals were in favor of lockdowns while conservatives were opposed. Using latest research in evolutionary theory, I show how this simple unidimensional view is wrong. After all, the country that stood out for not enforcing strict social distancing is Sweden, hardly a bastion of conservative thinking. Conservatives come in two flavors, economic and social. I show that economic conservatives were opposed to lockdowns while social conservatives were in favor. This is because when it came to COVID-19, you could err on both sides. You could err on the side of doing too much, shutting down all economic activity and causing tremendous economic damage and the consequent loss in livelihoods and yes, lives that come with it. Or you could do too little and let the disease propagate indiscriminately. In order to combat the recession caused by lockdowns, countries started printing money to keep interest rates low. This in turn fueled huge bubbles in asset and property markets. COVID-19 was always going to cause a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich, because the lockdowns disproportionately affected blue-collar workers whose jobs could not be done from home. The white-collar workers, so-called laptop class, could easily work from home and faced no threats to their livelihoods. The laptop class took advantage of the low interest rates to invest in shares and houses. This will exacerbate long-term inequality both within countries and across countries. Globally, the death rates were very low for developing nations with their relatively younger populations. COVID is a disease that primarily afflicts the elderly. The young are not greatly at risk. Yet the economies of these countries have been hit very hard by lockdown policies, which were blindly copied from developed nations. While developed countries could mitigate some of the economic damage via their social safety nets, developing countries had no such recourse. As the cricket legend and the current Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, pointed out early on in 2020, for citizens of the poorer countries, the decision to lock down to prevent COVID deaths results in many more deaths from starvation and many other far more deadly diseases. Lockdowns will go down in history as a huge public policy failure. I end the book by providing some suggestions for policy changes that can help prevent such catastrophic mistakes in the future. A key insight is that pandemics cause widespread social and economic damage and therefore require multifaceted expertise. Defining COVID-19 narrowly as a public health issue only was a mistake. The public health experts whose recommendations were implemented often did not, and indeed had no training to understand the trade-offs and the unintended consequences of the lockdown policies they were pushing. If nothing else, I hope the next time we are faced with a crisis like this, policymakers would assemble a range of expertise around the table and undertake a careful analysis of the relative costs and benefits of various actions. This would ensure that we confront future crises in a more equitable manner than we did this one. The book is written in an extremely user-friendly manner. It's meant for a general audience. There is no need to have a background in economics or psychology or neuroscience or anything like this. Anyone who's interested in understanding what happened, why it happened, and why we were so eager to accept these restrictions on our lives that has caused massive social and economic damage. And the damage is ongoing, and we will understand the true extent of this damage over time as more and more evidence comes to light. It's an extremely easy to read book. It's written in a user-friendly language, and I hope that you will take a look at the book and hopefully you will find the contents of the book interesting. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the very best.